somewhere between the pages of an ancient Bible and the ink-stained margins of a medieval grimoire, a king picked up a ring, and the world got a lot stranger. That king was Solomon, and depending on which source you're reading, he was either the wisest ruler who ever lived, a master architect who built the most famous temple in human history, or the one man powerful enough to summon demons by name, press them into labour, and bind them to his will with a single seal stamped in gold. 3 very different portraits of the same person. And the question of how you get from the first to the third is one of the stranger journeys in the history of religion, folklore, and the human imagination. Tonight, or this morning, or whatever quiet hour you found to listen, we're going to follow that journey all the way through. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly what it's here for. So maybe subscribe and then drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I genuinely check them. It's one of the things I love most about making these. Someone in Tokyo winding down at midnight. Someone in Sao Paulo who can't sleep at 2 in the morning. Someone in Edinburgh with the curtains still dark at 4. All listening to the same story at the same moment from completely different corners of the world. Tell me where you are now, back to Solomon and his demons. The central claim at the heart of this story is specific enough to feel almost bureaucratic. Not just demons in general, not vague dark forces, but 72 of them, named, catalogued, ranked, each with particular powers and particular weaknesses, each compelled by a ring bearing a divine seal to stop whatever chaos they were causing and get to work. The most famous version of this list describes them in extraordinary detail. One commands hurricanes, another causes disease, another can teach philosophy. One knows the location of hidden treasure. They have faces like lions and bodies of men, and sometimes neither. They arrive in clouds of smoke or riding pale horses, or simply appearing, furious and bound, before a king sitting on a throne who is completely unimpressed. It is one of the more remarkable images in world literature, and almost none of it appears in the Bible. That gap between what the Bible actually says about Solomon and what later traditions turned him into is really the engine of this whole story. The Bible gives us a Solomon who is brilliant, who is flawed, who builds an extraordinary temple and marries too many foreign wives and eventually drifts from the faith he was supposed to embody. That's a genuinely rich and complicated portrait, but it doesn't include anything about demon-binding rings or supernatural workforces or a numbered list of infernal spirits waiting to be commanded. For that, you have to go somewhere else entirely. You have to go to texts that were written centuries after the Hebrew Bible was compiled, texts that were circulating in a very different world, a world that was deeply, almost obsessively, interested in the relationship between human beings and invisible powers. Those texts have names like the Testament of Solomon, probably written sometime in the first few centuries of the Common Era, drawing on material that may be even older. And then, much later, documents like the Lesser Key of Solomon, known by its Latin name, the Lemegeton, which found its final form sometime in the 17th century, but borrows from sources stretching back to the medieval period and possibly beyond. These are not scripture in any mainstream religious sense. They occupy a strange middle territory, part religious text, part magical manual, part mythology, and they were treated with wildly different levels of seriousness, depending on who was reading them and when. So tonight's story has to be honest about its sources. When we're talking about the historical King Solomon, we're working mostly from the Hebrew Bible, cross-referenced with what archaeology has managed to uncover about the ancient Near East. When we're talking about the demon-commanding tradition, we're working from late antique texts that were themselves synthesizing older beliefs, and from medieval grimoires that were themselves copying and reinterpreting those texts. None of these sources are reporting eyewitness history. What they're doing is something arguably more interesting. They're revealing how people across many different centuries and cultures tried to make sense of power, wisdom, the supernatural, and the terrifying possibility that the world is full of forces that could destroy you unless you know the right words, the right names, the right seal pressed in wax. That's not nothing. That's actually a very human kind of document. The number 72 is going to come up again and again throughout this story, and it's worth holding on to as a question even now, before we've answered it. Why 72? Not 70, not 100, not some rounder number that feels more intuitive. 72 shows up in a surprising number of places across ancient and medieval thought. There are 72 names of God in certain Jewish mystical traditions. There are 72 disciples sent out in the Gospel of Luke. Certain calculations of the zodiac divide the sky into 72 divisions. The number has a kind of numerological gravity in the ancient world, a feeling of completeness that's hard to pin down precisely but clearly mattered to the people who chose it. Whether that explains why 72 demons ended up bound to Solomon specifically is a question we'll spend some time with later, and the answer turns out to be genuinely interesting. For now, just notice the specificity of it. This tradition wasn't content with vague impressions. It wanted a list. It wanted names. It wanted ranks and powers and the exact sigil you'd need to draw on parchment if you wanted to call a particular spirit and not accidentally summon the wrong one. There's something almost scientific about that impulse, or at least something that felt scientific to the people practicing it. The universe was governed by rules, and if you could learn the rules, you could navigate the forces that most people were simply at the mercy of. And Solomon, for reasons that will become clearer as the story unfolds, became the figure onto whom all of that ambition got projected. The wisest man in the world, the builder of the most sacred structure in the ancient Near East, the king who trafficked with powers beyond ordinary human understanding. Of course he knew the 72 names. Of course he had the ring. Of course he could look a demon in its terrible face and simply say, "You work for me now." How a historical king became. That figure is a story that moves through centuries of storytelling, religious anxiety, political imagination, and genuine philosophical inquiry. It's a stranger journey than you might expect, and it starts, as most good things do, with what we actually know. What we actually know about Solomon comes primarily from two books of the Hebrew Bible, 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles. And what those books describe is genuinely impressive, even before you add a single demon to the picture. He reigns for 40 years over a unified kingdom of Israel and Judah. He builds the temple in Jerusalem, the structure that will become the central sacred site of Judaism for centuries, the building that later generations will mourn for millennia after its destruction. He accumulates wealth on a scale the text can barely describe without running out of comparisons. 700 wives, 300 concubines, horses imported from Egypt, chariots by the thousand, foreign dignitaries arriving from every direction just to sit in his court and listen to him talk. The Queen of Sheba makes what the Bible presents as an almost pilgrim-like journey just to test his famous mind, and when she gets there, she runs out of hard questions before he runs out of answers. At the centre of all of this is wisdom. Not cleverness, not cunning, but something the text treats as a divine gift, a quality of understanding that goes beyond ordinary human intelligence. The famous story is told early in his reign. God appears to the young Solomon in a dream and offers him anything he wants. Solomon asks not for wealth or military victory or long life, but for understanding. The ability to discern between good and evil, to judge his people rightly. And God is so pleased by the request that he gives Solomon the wisdom he asked for, and everything else besides. That scene sets the tone for his entire biblical portrait. Solomon is a man who, at his best, channels something beyond himself. His judgments are almost eerie in their precision. The most famous example is probably the two women who both claim the same infant as their child. Solomon orders the baby cut in half and divided between them. One woman immediately surrenders her claim rather than let the child die. Solomon gives the baby to her. She was clearly the real mother, and he knew she would react that way before she did. It is less a legal ruling than a psychological experiment, less courtroom than theatre. The point is that ordinary human reasoning wouldn't have gotten there. Something else was operating. But here's the tension the biblical text builds in, quietly, and then, toward the end, not so quietly at all. Wisdom is not the same as faithfulness. And Solomon, for all his gifts, drifts. Those 700 wives are not just a sign of political reach and personal excess. Many of them are foreign women from kingdoms with their own gods, and they bring those gods with them. The older Solomon gets, the more he accommodates their worship. He builds shrines for their deities on the hills outside Jerusalem. He participates in practices that the editors of these texts consider catastrophic betrayals of the covenant his people had made with their God. By the end of his reign, the judgment against him is severe. The kingdom will be torn from his dynasty, not immediately, as a concession to the memory of his father David, but soon. 1 generation later, the unified kingdom splits in two, and the fracture is permanent. So even within the Bible itself, Solomon is a complicated figure, divinely gifted and humanly flawed, unmatched in wisdom and still capable of spectacular failures of faithfulness. That complexity mattered enormously for how later traditions would handle him. He was too great to ignore and too compromised to simply venerate, which meant he was available for interpretation in ways a straightforwardly holy figure might not have been. What the biblical text does not say is almost as important as what it does. It says nothing about Solomon commanding demons. It says nothing about a magical ring. It doesn't describe him performing exorcisms or binding spirits or negotiating with supernatural forces of any kind beyond ordinary prophecy and prayer. His power in the Bible is political and intellectual. His miracles, such as they are, operate through judgment and discernment. The supernatural architecture that later traditions built around him is simply not there in the foundational text. But there were small openings. There always are. The book of Proverbs is traditionally attributed to Solomon, as is Ecclesiastes and the Song of Songs, which gave him an association with wisdom literature that stretched well beyond politics into something more philosophical and esoteric. And there's a broader pattern across the ancient world worth paying attention to. Legendary wise men, especially those associated with healing and knowledge of hidden things, tended to accumulate magical reputations over time. You can see it with figures like the Egyptian Imhotep, who started as a historical architect and physician, and was eventually worshipped as a god of medicine, or with Pythagoras, the Greek mathematician whose followers attributed to him increasingly miraculous abilities as the generations passed. The principle seems to be that genuine extraordinary ability in one domain, whether architecture or mathematics or statecraft, opens a door in the popular imagination. If he knew that much, what else might he have known? If he could do that, what else might he have been able to do? Solomon was, by any measure, a figure onto whom that kind of projection could easily be made. The historical king and the literary king were already two different people before the demon lists even existed. The distance between them would only grow. To understand how Solomon could ever end up as a master of 72 demons, you have to step out of the clean lines of the biblical narrative and back into the world that produced it. A world where sickness had personality, where misfortune had an address, and where invisible neighbours were taken as seriously as kings. Imagine living in a small town somewhere in the ancient Near East. It could be a village in the Judean hills, a neighbourhood in Babylon, a cramped courtyard in a Phoenician port. The details change, but the basic structure of reality is almost the same. There is one high god, or maybe a small family of great gods, who are thought to sit above everything. There are lesser gods, tied to cities, rivers, storms, fertility. And underneath them, around them, slipping between them, There are spirits, not a few odd exceptions, but layers upon layers of them. House spirits, field spirits, night spirits, spirits of crossroads and doorways and latrines, spirits that bring fever, spirits that stir up quarrels, spirits that ride on the wind and slip into dreams. You don't look at a sudden illness and think, I must have caught a virus. You look at it and think, something hostile has come close. A child spikes a fever. Their eyes glaze, their words become confused, their body jerks as if pulled by strings you can't see. For us, it's an emergency room and maybe a diagnosis of meningitis or epilepsy. For them, it's almost impossible not to see a presence. Something has gripped the child, something is on them. The language in many ancient texts is literally that. A demon is said to have seized a person. Or take a string of misfortunes. 1 year the crops fail. The next year someone's herd dies suddenly. A few months later, a roof collapses for no clear reason, killing an uncle who'd made enemies. In a world without probability theory, without structural engineering, where so much of life feels already precarious, that pattern doesn't feel random. It feels like agency. Someone, visible or invisible, has taken notice. And if there is agency, there must be intention. And if there is intention, you can try to negotiate. That is where rituals, amulets, and incantations come in. Not as fringe curiosities, but as ordinary tools woven into daily life. You might wear a small pendant with a carved figure or an inscribed line of text around your neck. Not for decoration, but as a protective barrier, a kind of spiritual firewall. At the city gate, you might pass a relief showing a grimacing creature, teeth bared, crouched like a guard dog in stone. It looks threatening, but it's protective, scaring off worse things. Under the threshold of a house, a little bowl might be buried upside down, inscribed with names that are supposed to trap wandering hostile forces so they can't cross into the living space. In Mesopotamia, we actually have hundreds of these incantation bowls and clay tablets. They often read like legal documents addressed to the supernatural world. The text will identify specific spirits by name, list their activities, and then command them by a higher power to depart, or to stay bound in a corner, or to go down into the underworld. Some even include crude drawings of a bound figure, hands tied, as if the drawing itself is part of the magic. The logic is remarkably consistent. You name the spirit. You state its function. And once that's done, you have some leverage. The unknown is amorphous and terrifying, but the moment you can say, this is the one that brings headaches, or this is the one that causes miscarriages, you have turned a shapeless fear into a category. A problem with a known profile. In many of these cultures, knowing the name of a being is not just about identification. It is exposure. Names are treated as a kind of handle. If you know the true name of a god, an angel, or a demon, you can pull on that handle. You can invoke it, constrain it, or threaten it by appealing to a still higher name. Incantations pile up these names like legal citations. By the name of X, son of Y, servant of Z, I adjure you, spirit of such and such affliction, leave this body and do not return. It isn't that the spirit is evil in a modern moral sense. That is a crucial difference. For us, demon tends to mean a being that is morally corrupt, bent on wickedness for its own sake, an enemy of goodness as an abstract principle. In much of the older Near Eastern material, spirits are more like forces or functions. They have jobs. Some jobs are pleasant for humans, some are not. The spirit that causes fever is not sitting in a cosmic courtroom plotting how to rebel against goodness. It is a fever spirit. That is what it does. The way a scorpion stings or a desert wind dries things out. Even the big gods themselves are often morally mixed by our standards. A storm god brings rain that keeps fields alive and also storms that flatten houses. A fertility goddess may nurture life, and also demand offerings that we would find disturbing. Good and bad are less about moral categories and more about position in a network. Is this power currently favouring us, or harming us, or simply being dangerous in the way fire is dangerous? So the religious landscape becomes less like a war between absolute good and absolute evil, and more like a complex ecology of powers. Some are more predictable, some less. Some can be bargained with. Some must be appeased. Some can, with the right words and objects, be forced to behave. In that kind of world, expertise about invisible forces is as valuable as farming techniques or military tactics. If someone knows which amulet to wear in pregnancy, which psalm or spell to recite over a sick child, which days are dangerous to travel because certain spirits are thought to wander, that person is tremendously useful. They don't have to be called a magician. They can be a priest, a healer, a wise woman, a scribe. What matters is that they know the catalogue. They know what does what. They can match problem to spirit, spirit to ritual, ritual to hoped-for outcome. That is one reason long lists of supernatural beings become so important. They are not just stories, they are reference works. The Babylonian scholar has a tablet with a lineup of diseased demons and their symptoms. The Judean priest has traditions about unclean spirits and what kinds of impurity they bring. The Egyptian magician has handbooks for which divine names to invoke against snakebite, which against nightmares. Over time, the act of listing itself takes on a kind of power. To enumerate is to control, to say, here are the kinds of forces that can hurt you, and here is how each may be countered. Later Jewish and Christian demon catalogues sit squarely in this tradition. The number 72 is not an arbitrary flourish. It fits into a world where spiritual mastery is expressed as a table of correspondences, a complete set. When you put Solomon back into this environment, the later stories about him start to feel less like wild departures and more like exaggerations of something already in the air. He is remembered as the wisest of kings. He is associated with proverbs, with riddles, with insights into the natural world. Some later traditions even say he knew the speech of animals and the secrets of plants. If he could categorize human behavior with such precision, why not the behavior of spirits? If he could judge between two women in a way that revealed hidden motives, why not interrogate invisible beings and determine which one was responsible for which kind of harm? A world saturated with functional spirits, with amulets and incantations and the power of names, is a world looking for a figure like Solomon. Someone who doesn't just endure this crowded cosmos but orders it. Someone who can stand in the middle of the invisible traffic and say, you go here, you go there, you stop that, you help with this. By the time later authors began to imagine Solomon not only as wise, but as a kind of supernatural administrator, assigning demons to tasks and binding them with a ring, they were not inventing the idea of spirit mastery from nothing. They were taking the everyday logic of their culture, that spirits have functions, that names constrain, that knowledge protects, and pushing it to an almost mathematical extreme. If every misfortune can be traced to a spirit with a particular function, then in principle a perfect wise man could map them all. He could know which spirit does what, which name stops which harm. He could compile not just a tablet or two, but a complete directory of the unseen. And in the ancient imagination, that man already existed. His name was Solomon. Once the biblical stories about Solomon were in circulation, they did not stay frozen on the page. They lived in communities. They were repeated in synagogues and marketplaces, pondered by scribes, embroidered in conversation, brought into contact with new worries and new empires. And over the centuries between the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple and the rise of early rabbinic Judaism, Solomon quietly changed occupations. He never stopped being a king, but he picked up extra jobs. In the biblical books that made it into the final canon, Solomon is already more than a political ruler. He is a judge who can see through lies, a sage who is said to have composed thousands of proverbs and songs, a builder who oversees the temple, the palace, whole networks of fortifications, a kind of natural philosopher who is described as speaking of trees and animals and creeping things. In the centuries after the exile to Babylon, that profile became a starting point, not an ending. You can almost watch the process at work. Take a revered figure whose life is already settled in Scripture. Now put generations of anxious, imaginative people in front of that figure. People dealing with foreign overlords, social upheaval, and the everyday threats of sickness and misfortune. The character on the page becomes a vessel. Whatever powers you wish existed in your world, whatever gaps you feel in your own security can be poured into him. So Solomon, in Second Temple Jewish imagination, begins to expand. He is still the great judge. Stories circulate about his court cases, his penetrating questions, his ability to make hidden motives rise to the surface. But judgment, in a world thick with spirits, is not just about human litigants. It is also about invisible agents. If your neighbour accuses you of bewitching his crops, or if a family is suspected of harbouring an unclean force, who decides? The idea of a Solomon who can judge between living women easily stretches to a Solomon who can judge between spirit and symptom, curse and coincidence. He is still the sage. Later texts, some preserved, many lost, attribute whole bodies of wisdom literature to him, collections of proverbs, instructions on proper behaviour, reflections on vanity and pleasure and death. Wisdom like that is already a form of power, the power to anticipate consequences, to see how small actions ripple out across a community. In a culture where knowledge of the right words can soothe a fever or protect a house, it is a short imaginative step from moral wisdom to specialized expertise in spiritual techniques. He is still the builder. The temple looms enormous in Jewish memory after the exile. It is not just a building, it is the place where heaven and earth are thought to meet. To be remembered as the one who planned and dedicated that structure is to be given a kind of architectural mystique. If the temple is a model of the cosmos in stone and cedar, then the one who designed it must understand the hidden architecture of reality itself. Out of this cluster of roles, another begins to form, Solomon as ritual expert, Solomon as exorcist, Solomon as wonder worker. You can see early hints of this in writings from the Second Temple period and the centuries just after. They don't yet talk about 72 demons building the temple, but they are already circulating stories in which Solomon commands spirits, knows their names, and uses divine authority to make them behave. In these traditions, the crucial bridge is secret knowledge. The Bible already presents Solomon as someone who asked God not for long life or victory in war, but for a listening heart, an ability to discern. That request is remembered as being so pleasing that God grants not only wisdom but riches and honour. For later writers, that choice becomes a doorway. If God liked Solomon's request that much, perhaps God also entrusted him with further secrets. The names of angels, the true structure of the heavens, the hidden correspondences between earthly things and their spiritual counterparts. Second Temple Judaism was a time of intense fascination with such things. The same broad period that produced the final form of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes also produced the Book of Daniel, with its visions of angelic princes and sealed heavenly books, the Enochic literature, with its tours of the cosmos and various apocalyptic and mystical texts that imagine chosen humans being given access to divine calendars, star maps, and heavenly languages. In that climate, the idea of a human being entrusted with dangerous secret knowledge was not strange. It was almost expected. Someone, somewhere in the sacred past, must have received the manual. Who better than Solomon? So traditions begin to imagine him as the recipient of the name in a special way, not just permitted to pronounce the divine name in liturgical settings, but given access to its hidden permutations, its most potent combinations. And if, as many believed, the divine name is the ultimate key that unlocks or binds all spiritual powers, then a Solomon who truly grasps it would be able, with care, to direct spirits like workers on a cosmic building site. Alongside this internal development, the external world was changing. After the Babylonians came the Persians. After the Persians, the Greeks. Then eventually the Romans. Each empire brought its own stories, its own experts, its own ways of talking about hidden forces. Under Persian rule, Jewish communities lived for generations in an environment where Zoroastrian ideas about cosmic struggle were in the air. Titanic conflicts between truth and the lie, good spirits and bad, a final judgment that would purify creation. Some of these themes began to refract through Jewish thinking. The older sense of spirits as more neutral forces gradually tilted, in some strands of tradition toward more moralized figures. Angels as champions of God's order, demons as opponents. Later, under Hellenistic influence, another layer was added. Greek traditions about philosophers who could command daimons, about sages who knew the secret structure of the cosmos, fused with Near Eastern practices of incantation and amulets. Intellectuals debated about the soul in Greek. Village healers muttered inherited Aramaic formulas over the sick. The boundary between philosopher, magician, and holy man was porous. Jewish authors were not isolated from this swirl. They lived in it. Some resisted it. Some adapted. Some translated it into their own categories. Stories about Solomon often sat right at the crossroads. In some Greek and Aramaic texts from the early centuries of the Common Era, Solomon begins to appear not only as a model of wisdom, but as the name you invoke when you are doing something about a demon. An exorcist writes a formula on a bowl and includes Solomon in the chain of authority. A healer adjusts a ritual and folds Solomon into the spoken words. The King of Israel has become, in effect, a patron saint of practical spiritual problem solving. This is not just random embellishment. It reflects needs. Communities under foreign rule, subject to unpredictable violence and economic strain, dealing with plagues, infertility, and sudden accidents, wanted to believe that there were tools for pushing back. They were steeped in a world where such tools were imagined to exist. Spells, seals, divine names. At the same time, they were bound by a monotheistic faith that forbade many overt forms of magic and demanded exclusive loyalty to Israel's God. One way to reconcile these pressures is to say the techniques are not magic in the forbidden sense. They are applications of God-given wisdom entrusted to righteous figures. You are not bargaining with random spirits. You are following in the footsteps of Solomon, who used knowledge granted from above to set the invisible world in order. The more dangerous and unpredictable life feels, the more attractive that model becomes. Solomon's portfolio expands in the stories because people need someone like him to be on duty in more and more areas of their existence. He is pulled toward the fault lines of their anxieties. He judges because justice among humans is fragile. He builds because the temple's stability is under threat. He speaks proverbs because right conduct feels complicated. And he commands demons because invisible harm is the kind that feels most out of anyone's control. By the time early rabbinic teachers are gathering and debating, these layers of tradition are already in place. Some are accepted, some are questioned, some are treated with amused caution. There are discussions about Solomon knowing the languages of animals, Solomon indulging in too much magical experimentation, Solomon perhaps overreaching and being humbled. Even in the act of warning against excess, the stories assume his extraordinary reach, and threaded through it all is the same logic you saw with the incantation bowls. If you can turn fear into a list, you have already done something powerful. If you can say, here are the kinds of spirits, here are the right names, here are the ways a righteous person might direct them under God's authority, you have carved out a small island of order in a chaotic sea. The legend of Solomon slowly becoming a wonder worker, an exorcist, even a commander of demons, is not just a tale about one king gone mythical. It is a mirror of the centuries that shaped it, centuries of conquest and cultural borrowing, of familiar rituals being translated into new languages, of communities trying to walk the tightrope between inherited faith and pressing fear. Out of that tension grows a figure who is both deeply pious and tremendously capable, someone whose wisdom does not stop at human arguments, but reaches into the machinery behind misfortune itself. From there, it is only one more imaginative step to picture him in a very particular setting, seated like a judge, summoning spirits to testify, learning their names and jobs one by one, and binding them to work. That is the world of the Testament of Solomon, and it is where we go next. Sometime in the first few centuries of the Common Era, an anonymous writer sat down and did something audacious. They took all those drifting stories about Solomon the Wise, Solomon the Exorcist, Solomon the Knower of Names, and turned them into a single elaborate tale. Not a short episode, not a proverb, but a little book. Today we call it the Testament of Solomon. It isn't part of any biblical canon. It survives in Greek, in manuscripts copied and recopied by Christian scribes. It probably drew on earlier Jewish traditions, picked up Hellenistic ideas, absorbed folklore from healers and magicians along the way. Scholars argue about the precise dates and layers, but most would place its core somewhere between the late Roman Empire and early Byzantine period. In other words, a world full of demons, angels, and imperial bureaucracy. A perfect setting for what the Testament actually is. The story opens with something concrete and familiar, the building of the temple. Solomon is overseeing construction. Stones are being cut, timber lifted, metal shaped. But there is a problem. One particular worker, a young boy, is wasting away. Day after day he grows thinner, weaker, more exhausted, even though he eats enough. Eventually he confesses to Solomon that every night something comes to him, steals his wages in the form of food and sucks out his strength. This is how ancient people described what we might call a wasting illness, a sleep paralysis episode, or a chronic unexplained fatigue. In the world of the Testament it is personified. It has a name, a will, a pattern. And Solomon, hearing the boy's story, realizes that if you want to build a house for God in a haunted world, you can't ignore that kind of thing. You have to address it. So he prays. In response, he is given a ring. In some versions, the ring comes from the archangel Michael, acting as a messenger of God. It bears a seal, often described as a 5-pointed or 6-pointed star, and it has a very specific function. It can bind spirits. Whoever is stamped with this seal is compelled to appear, to speak, and to obey. Armed with this new tool, Solomon sends the boy back to his attacker with instructions. When the spirit comes again, the boy is to fling the ring at it and command it, by the authority of Solomon and the name of God, to report to the king. The plan works. The demon is dragged into Solomon's presence. And with that, the narrative settles into its strange rhythm. The rest of the book is essentially one long courtroom session. Solomon sits as judge. One by one demons are marched in front of him. He does not immediately destroy them. He questions them. "What is your name?" he asks. "What is your function? What do you do to humans? Where do you dwell? At what times are you strongest? And by what angel or by what word are you defeated?" Each spirit answers. Some boast, some whine, some try to bargain. They describe their powers, causing illness, stirring up lust, inflaming anger, choking infants, misleading travellers, ruining crops, provoking epilepsy like seizures, encouraging perjury, whispering suicidal thoughts. The list is long. It moves slowly. It is methodical. In between the answers, Solomon sometimes reacts. He expresses horror or disgust, calls for an angel or laughs at a demon's weakness. He orders some of them to be chained and put to work on the temple, hauling stones, lifting water, cutting blocks. Others are told they will remain bound until a particular liturgical act, or a certain prayer, drives them off. Read this way. The Testament is doing something very deliberate. It is taking free-floating fears and giving them dossiers. Instead of a vague sense that something might cause miscarriage or madness, the text says, here is a particular spirit who does this. Here is its name, here is what it looks like, here is how it operates, and here is the exact ritual key that neutralizes it. The format is almost bureaucratic. Name, office, jurisdiction, weakness, filing instructions. To someone lying awake in a small house in late antiquity, listening to the wind scrape at the door and wondering if the sickness in the next room is natural or not, that kind of catalogue could feel like a lifeline. It suggests that the invisible world is not just chaos. It is populated by agents who follow rules, and those rules can be learned. At the same time, the book is not a dry manual. It is full of odd, vivid personalities. Some demons claim origins in the stars, or in primordial chaos. Some say they operate under the authority of larger cosmic forces. A few are linked to female night spirits, others to specific diseases or bodily organs. There are grotesque composite forms, half animal, half human, associated with wind or fire or the depths of the sea. Occasionally the text veers into cosmic geography. A spirit might mention dwelling in the constellation of the Bear, or haunting the Red Sea, or acting on humans when the moon is dark. You can feel astrological lore, Greek philosophical ideas about elemental forces, and older Near Eastern demonology all woven together. From a modern scholarly perspective, the Testament of Solomon looks less like a single, cleanly composed work and more like a layered scrapbook. Some parts probably go back to Jewish demonological traditions from the Second Temple period. The emphasis on the divine name, the idea of angels as wardens over specific forces, echoes of traditions about spirits from the Book of Enoch and related writings. Other elements seem clearly Hellenistic or later, astrological terms, philosophical vocabulary, even small moralizing asides that feel at home in a Christian monastic environment. There are passages that sound like excerpts from real incantation practices. There are passages that look more like theological reflection. Many researchers think the core narrative, the boy, the ring, the demons building the temple, is older, and that later hands expanded the list of spirits, added new interrogations, and reshaped certain episodes to fit changing concerns. The result is a patchwork, but it is a patchwork that holds. What unifies it is that courtroom. Solomon, seated as judge. Demons, treated almost like litigants or witnesses, compelled to testify about their own crimes and vulnerabilities. Angels named as higher officials in a celestial hierarchy, whose very mention can shut a demon down. In that setting, exorcism becomes a form of legal procedure. You are not shouting into the dark, hoping something listens. You are following precedent, citing previous cases, calling on established authorities. The demon must answer, because that is how the universe is structured. The effect on the reader or the listener is subtle but important. You begin with fear, of sickness, of sudden rage, of strange compulsions, of nightmares. As you move through the text, those fears are given shape and protocol. This one attacks at dawn, that one causes choking in children. This one misleads merchants. Each in turn is cross-examined and then assigned to labour under God's king. It reads in many places like a catalogue of anxieties from the ancient Mediterranean world. Infant mortality, infertility, fevers, collapsing buildings, shipwrecks, legal injustice, sexual jealousy, lying in court, sudden accidents in fields and workshops all appear refracted through the mouths of demons. The Testament is, in that sense, a psychological document, as much as a religious one. It tells you what people worried about by turning those worries into characters. And at the centre of all this is Solomon, not just as a wonder worker who can shout louder than the forces of chaos, but as a listener. He hears the boy's complaint. He listens, patiently or sternly, to each spirit. He asks precise questions. He gathers information. He writes it down. The wisdom that began, in biblical tradition, as the ability to discern between two human women now extends to sorting the entire invisible population of the cosmos. For later ritual practitioners, that interrogation format would become a template. Knowing a spirit's name, office, and binding angel becomes the standard way to think about spiritual power. For modern readers, it gives us an unusually intimate window into how late antique communities tried to domesticate their fears. From here, it is natural to ask about the tool that makes all this possible. The object that turns a frightened boy into a successful bait, and an ordinary king into the master of a demonic workforce. The ring itself, the seal it bears, and the idea that an inscription properly granted and rightly used can bind 72 spirits to build a temple. For people in late antiquity, a ring was not just jewellery, it was paperwork. A signet ring marked with a distinctive design could turn a scrap of wax into a royal decree. You pressed it into soft material, and suddenly this document, this contract, this shipment of goods, was no longer just words and marks. It carried the presence and authority of the person whose seal it bore. If you think with that world in mind, the Ring of Solomon in the Testament stops looking like a random magic trick and starts to feel almost obvious. Of course, a king who controls spirits would do it with a seal. The text leans into this. The ring is not described as a wand or a sword. It doesn't shoot fire. It doesn't slice demons to pieces. It stamps them. It bears a sign that, once impressed upon a spirit, establishes jurisdiction. In the story, this is framed as lawful power. Solomon does not sneak off to a witch in the hills to learn forbidden arts. He prays. The ring is given, the design on it is not some private sigil he invented, but a mark entrusted to him from above. When he or the boy commands demons, they do so in the name of the Lord God, and by the authority represented in that tiny piece of metal. To a listener in a world saturated with imperial bureaucracy, that would ring true. They knew what a Roman governor's seal could do. It could compel soldiers to move, taxes to be collected, prisoners to be transported. They knew how a legal document, once sealed, became binding in a way that mere spoken agreements were not. Many would also have seen or heard about amulets and charms bearing small images and inscriptions, worn against the evil eye or illness. The Solomonic ring gathers all of that, the administrative, the legal, and the apotropaic into one object. On the historical side, there are likely several threads feeding this motif. One is the very old Near Eastern practice of using cylinder seals and signet rings to mark ownership and authorize orders. Archaeologists have found them from Mesopotamia to Israel, tiny carved stones that, when rolled over clay, produce intricate designs. Biblical texts mention signet rings as symbols of royal power. In the Book of Esther, the king's ring is used to seal decrees that cannot be revoked. In Genesis, Pharaoh gives Joseph his signet ring as a sign that Joseph now acts with his authority. Another thread is the broader Mediterranean fascination with engraved gems. From the Hellenistic period onward, magico-religious texts talk about stones engraved with figures of gods, animals or abstract symbols, combined with names and voces magicae, magical nonsense words, that give the wearer protection or influence over certain forces. An angel on a gem could ward off fever, a lion and a particular name might repel nightmares. The Testament of Solomon sits in that landscape. Its ring is, in effect, a super amulet. Its seal is not just a protective mark, but a juridical one. Stamp a demon with it, and you have served cosmic papers. Over time, that seal took on a life of its own. Later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions begin talking explicitly about the Seal of Solomon. At first, this phrase might simply mean Solomon's signet, the way you might say the royal seal for any king. But by the medieval period, it hardens into something more specific, a name design, a recognizable icon. In many Islamic and later occult sources, the Seal of Solomon becomes a six-pointed figure, two interlocking triangles forming a hexagram. In other strands, especially some early occult manuscripts, it appears as a pentagram, a five-pointed star sometimes drawn with a single point upward. Both symbols will at different times be called the Seal of Solomon, and both will gather layers of meaning as they travel. These geometric figures fit well with late antique and medieval ideas about number, harmony, and the structure of the cosmos. Interlocking triangles can represent heaven and earth, spirit and matter, or the mutual interpenetration of divine and created realms. A star drawn in a single unbroken line can stand for unity, the unbroken power of the divine name, or the human body viewed as a microcosm of the universe. None of this is spelled out in the earliest Solomon stories. The Testament simply speaks of a seal, occasionally mentioning stars. The exact shape is left vague, but as centuries pass, artists, scribes, and ritual specialists all need something to draw. Manuals of magic want clear diagrams. Mosque windows and synagogue pages need concrete motifs. So the vague seal crystallizes. It appears carved on talismans, painted in manuscripts, woven into textiles. Medieval grimoires trace elaborate pentagrams and hexagrams and label them as the Seal of Solomon, then surround them with angelic names. In Jewish mystical texts, the hexagram can appear as a symbol of divine protection and covenant. In Islamic legends, Solomon's seal ring bearing the name of God becomes the key to his mastery over jinn, animals, and the winds. At the same time, theologians and storytellers are quietly negotiating a tension that never really goes away. Is Solomon commanding spirits because he has learned an advanced form of sorcery? Or is he simply exercising a lawful authority granted by God? In pious versions, especially in mainstream Jewish and Christian commentary, the emphasis is strongly on the second option. Solomon's ring is a tool of divine permission. The power comes entirely from God's name and the will of heaven. Solomon does not coerce God, he acts as God's appointed steward. The ring is like a judge's seal or a prophet's staff, an outward sign of a role already authorized from above. That distinction is important. It allows communities that are otherwise suspicious of magic to accept Solomonic stories. Exorcism becomes an extension of prayer, not a rival to it. The ring is safe to talk about because it is integrated into a theology of obedience, but more popular and magical traditions are often less tidy. In some later tales, especially in Arabic and Persian folklore, Solomon's ring can be lost, stolen or misused. A rebellious spirit might trick him out of it and temporarily gain the upper hand. In certain medieval grimoires, the Seal of Solomon is something a practitioner can reproduce on parchment or metal, inscribe with holy names, and then wield in rituals to summon and constrain spirits themselves. Here the line between divine permission and coercive sorcery blurs. Yes, the texts insist you must be pure, you must invoke God or the proper angels, you must be in a state of grace. But the underlying logic shifts. With the right symbols, the right words, and the correct arrangement on paper or on a ring, the magician can treat the invisible world as a system with rules you can learn and apply. In that sense, the Seal of Solomon becomes a kind of ritual technology. You don't have to possess the literal ancient ring. You can copy its form. You can reproduce the design that, in the story, once stamped a demon and sent it to work. Paired with the right psalms or invocations, that diagram stands in for the original object. The fiction of the narrative world translates into a set of instructions: how to draw, how to speak, how to command. Was there ever a historical ring belonging to an ancient king, engraved with a specific star, used to bind anything beyond human subjects? We can't know. The sources that mention it most vividly are already layers removed from the biblical Solomon, written in a world saturated with their own fears, hopes, and symbolic systems. What we can see is how powerful the idea proved to be. A single object that pulls together law and magic, kingship and craftsmanship, heaven's will and the human desire for control. A sign that could be worn on the hand impressed on a demon, sketched in a margin, or incised on a small piece of metal and hung over a doorway. For some it remains a literal thing, a lost treasure, a relic of a more enchanted age. For others it is a literary device, a story's way of turning abstract authority into something you can picture and pass from one character to another. For still others, especially in the world of ritual texts, it is a pattern, ink lines on a page that claim to tap into the same structure of the cosmos that the old legends describe. The ring that binds might never have existed as an artifact you could dig up, but as a symbol it has worked tirelessly for nearly 2,000 years. It has sealed decrees in the imagination, pressed meaning into stories, and left a faint, star-shaped imprint on the way later ages thought about power over unseen things. And it will matter even more when we turn to a curious detail that keeps surfacing whenever people talk about Solomon's demons. Not just that he controlled spirits, but that there were 72 of them. 72 is a strangely specific number. It's not a vague many or a round 100, or the biblical 40 that shows up everywhere, from the flood to the desert. It feels counted, tallied, as if somebody somewhere made a list and stopped at that exact point. And in some later traditions, that is more or less what happened. When you follow the story of Solomon forward into medieval Jewish mysticism and Christian ritual magic, you keep running into a parallel idea. Not 72 demons this time, but 72 names of God. This cluster of ideas circles around something called, in some streams of Kabbalistic thought, the Shem HaMeforash, the explicit or expressed name. The background is this. In Exodus, there is a short, dramatic scene at the Red Sea. Moses stretches out his hand, the waters part, Israel walks through, and the pursuing Egyptians are drowned. In the Hebrew Bible, that moment is told using 3 consecutive verses, each with exactly 72 letters. If you're just reading for the plot, that detail slides past unnoticed. But for scribes and mystics trained to see patterns in Scripture, nothing about number or repetition is accidental. Those 3 72-letter verses became raw material. Later Kabbalistic techniques treat them as a kind of code. One method found in medieval sources writes the first verse out in Hebrew letters from right to left, the second underneath it from left to right, and the third again from right to left. That zigzag arrangement produces 72 vertical columns, each made of 3 letters. Each column can then be read downward as a 3-letter name, 72 triplets. 72 names. Are these all names of God? Are they names of angelic powers? Keys to aspects of the divine will? Different authors will answer that differently, and the tradition mutates as it moves. But the core image is stable. Scripture, when read in a certain way, yields a structured set of 72 sacred expressions. From there, elaboration is almost inevitable. If you have 72 holy names, you can associate them with 72 angels. Those angels can be tied to degrees of the zodiac, hours of the day, moments in a ritual. Each name becomes both a word to recite and a point on a cosmic map. Magical and mystical manuals begin to list them, assign them sigils, and describe how they might be invoked for protection, insight, or help. The number, once anchored in a textual pattern, becomes available as a template. and that is where the demon lists start to mirror it. By the time we reach the Solomonic grimoires of the late medieval and early modern periods, especially in Christian Europe, the cosmos is often imagined in balanced hierarchies. Above, ranks of angels, below, ranks of fallen spirits. Between them, planets and spheres and the human soul, all nested in arrangements of 7, 12, and 72. In some systems, every one of the 72 divine names has a corresponding guardian angel. In others, those 72 angels are set in deliberate contrast to 72 rebellious spirits. The structure becomes almost architectural, a ladder of light and a ladder of shadow, rung for rung. The Goetic tradition that will eventually give us the famous 72 Demons of Solomon almost certainly grows in this climate of symmetry. One way to read it is as a kind of reflection. If God's power is refracted into 72 facets of holiness, then the distorted, chaotic realm of dangerous spirits might be catalogued in 72 counterpart forms. Not because anyone thought there was a literal census that came out even, but because 72 had already become a sacred number of organization. At the same time, the arithmetic of 72 has its own quiet attractions. It is a highly composite number. It breaks down neatly. 2 times 36, 3 times 24, 6 times 12, 8 times 9. In traditions that love harmony, proportion, and correspondence, a number that can be sliced into so many even parts is appealing. It can map onto zodiac signs, planetary hours, winds, nations, or disciples, depending on which symbolic system you're trying to knit together. In some Jewish and Christian writings, the world is described as having 70 or 72 nations. In later esoteric astrology, the circle of the sky can be divided into 72 5-degree faces or subsegments, each with its own flavour. Medieval numerology sometimes points to 72 as the number of quinaries in the 360-degree zodiac. All of these give writers permission to see 72 as a way to talk about the whole range, finely grained but complete. A practitioner who wants to imagine the invisible world as systematic map, like countable, can therefore do a lot with that single integer. 72 angels guarding 72 sectors of the heavens. 72 demons claiming 72 regions of human weakness. 72 names, 72 seals, 72 operations. It doesn't mean everyone agreed on what exactly they were counting. If you pick up different grimoires, you quickly notice that the lists don't line up neatly. Some give a full 72 spirits tied to Solomon's legend. Others give fewer or more, or drop the number entirely. Names shift spelling as they travel between Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and vernacular languages. A spirit that is a duke in one manuscript might be a king, or a marquis in another. New entities appear, old ones vanish, hierarchies are rearranged. Even in Kabbalistic sources, the 72 names of God are not always presented as a single settled canon. Some texts enumerate the triplets laboriously, others allude to them more abstractly. Later commentaries add layers of association that earlier ones never mention. So when we ask, what does the number 72 mean here? Part of the answer is that it means different things in different hands. Sometimes it is a direct echo of the Shem HaMeforash, a conscious attempt to create a demonic roster that mirrors an angelic or divine one. Sometimes it looks more like numerology, a desire to use a number associated with cosmic completeness and fine subdivision, rather than, say, 69 or 83. Sometimes it may simply be a matter of textual harmonization. If one influential book of magic tells you there are 72 spirits, and another tells you there are 56, but seems incomplete, the pressure to correct the second toward the first is strong. Scribes and compilers, working across centuries, quietly adjust counts, add entries, or fold separate traditions together until they too arrive at the reassuring benchmark 72. There is also a practical side. For a ritual specialist trying to memorize names, sigils, ranks, and functions, a bounded set is helpful. 72 is large enough to feel expansive, small enough to be, at least theoretically, learnable. Divided into groups 12 by 6 or 9 by 8, it becomes a mental filing cabinet. The number itself becomes a mnemonic frame, a promise that the chaos of spirits, however unruly in stories, has been domesticated into a list you can hold in your head, flip through and call upon. From the outside, especially from a modern historical perspective, it is hard to say where symbolic intention ends and simple tradition begins. Did the anonymous author who first tied Solomon to 72 demons consciously think, "I will mirror the 72 names of God from Exodus"? Or were they inheriting a cluster of sacred numbers, 70, 72, 12, 40, and fitting their story into the shapes already felt to be meaningful? We can't reach into those lost decisions. We only see the result. A mesh of texts in which 72 keep surfacing, as angels, as letters, as nations, as steps in a ritual, as subordinate kings under a greater king. By the late medieval period, the association between Solomon, 72 demons, and the wider architecture of sacred numbers has become thick enough that it feels natural, almost inevitable. But it was constructed, layer by layer, comment by comment, list by list. Beneath the legend of a wise king who once controlled exactly 72 spirits lies this quieter history of counting, correlating, and cataloguing. A history in which numbers are not just quantities, but shapes for ideas. Frameworks into which you can pour angels, demons, verses, and names until the invisible world starts to look, if you squint, like something ordered. In the next part of the story, we'll look more closely at those catalogues themselves. The actual demon lists that claim to preserve the names and jobs of Solomon's 72, and what those strangely bureaucratic documents reveal about the fears and fascinations of the people who copied them. Open one of those demon catalogues, and the first impression is strangely mundane. Yes, there are terrifying titles and infernal ranks. Kings of the East, princes of the air, dukes who ride on nightmare beasts. But immediately after the flourish, you find something that feels almost administrative, a brief description of what each spirit does, not who they are in some grand metaphysical sense. What they do, their function, their job. This is the first thing the catalogues reveal. They are not just spooky ornament on a legend about Solomon. They are attempts to turn a messy, frightening universe into something you can list, pass, and in theory, manage. A name, a rank, a specialty. Repeat 72 times. If you skim through a range of grimoires from the Testament of Solomon in late antiquity, through medieval handbooks, down into early modern texts like the Goetia, you start to see the same kinds of jobs appear again and again. Some demons cause sickness. They strike down the limbs, inflame the throat, induce fevers, spread wasting diseases. Others inflame lust, especially illicit or disruptive desire. They break marriages, tempt men and women into adulterous affairs, stir up obsessions that make people neglect their work and their families. Some specialize in conflict. They sow quarrels between friends, discord in households, rebellion among servants, war between princes. Others call up storms, damage crops, sink ships, bring hail at the wrong time of year. Some distort perception. They lie in dreams, whisper false prophecies, twist the meanings of omens, lead travellers astray at crossroads. Strip away the demonic language, and you have a list of very ordinary human anxieties. Illness, especially sudden and unexplained. Sexual desire that threatens social order. Violence and legal trouble. Weather, harvest, trade. Misinformation, misunderstanding, bad judgment. The demon catalogues are maps of where life feels fragile. In a world before antibiotics, meteorology, and psychology, these were not abstract categories. A fever that sweeps a village, a storm that flattens a field, an argument that tears a family apart, any of them could be the difference between survival and ruin. When you group these disasters under the heading of spirits and assign each one a responsible party, you are doing more than telling a story. You are building a system. Solomon's legend gives that system a frame. Here are the powers he once confronted, interrogated, and bound. Later writers, especially the ones who loved order, take the next step. They file those powers into drawers. This demon governs diseases of the head. That one governs the stomach. This one tempts craftsmen to be lazy. That one tempts judges to accept bribes. This one stirs up jealousy between women. That one incites landlords to raise rents. The details vary from text to text, but the principle is consistent. Every demon gets a scope of work. A jurisdiction, sometimes tiny, almost comically specific, sometimes vast and vague, but always something that can be written down. And because it is written down, it can in principle be controlled. That is the second thing the catalogues reveal. They are as much about mastery as about fear. The same entries that tell you this spirit causes X usually also tell you this is how you stop, redirect, or exploit X. You are given the demon's seal, the words to speak, the timing of the ritual, the offerings to avoid. In the Testament of Solomon, the king demands each demon's name, star, and the manner of thwarting its work. Later manuals imitate that pattern. A problem is only fully terrifying when it is nameless. Once it has a name, a sigil, a line in a handbook, it becomes something else, a case, a file, an item in the archive of things that have been faced before. Underneath the lurid imagery, there is a quiet logic at work. Cataloguing the forces that hurt you is a first step toward coping with them. Even if the rituals never worked in any literal sense, the text itself is a kind of magic circle, a bounded space where chaos is translated into lists, correspondences, if-then rules. Seen in that light, the recurring job descriptions become almost diagnostic categories. A possession that causes seizures looks like a familiar neurological disorder to a modern observer. To a medieval scribe copying a handbook, it looks like the signature of a particular spirit. A sudden wind that tears the roof from a barn becomes the footprint of another. And once you accept that premise, the demon lists start to look like an early attempt at a comprehensive taxonomy of misfortune. Health is there in all its vulnerable forms: plagues, madness, infertility, complications in childbirth. Labour is there, demons who hamper building projects, waste materials, confuse accounts, make workers idle, twist tools out of true. Household stability is there, spirits who damage goods, spoil food, create tensions between spouses, incite servants to theft. Even large-scale social concerns show up. Some demons whisper in the ears of rulers, causing unjust laws, rash wars, persecution. Others corrupt religious leaders, spread heresy, or drain the devotion of congregations. When you zoom out, the 72 spirits begin to resemble an upside-down mirror of everyday life in the societies that wrote about them. Every area that mattered, health, fertility, work, property, reputation, the smooth running of households and kingdoms had its demonic saboteurs. There is another layered pattern in these catalogues as well. Not all the names are original. Some, when you trace them back, look very much like older gods and local spirits that have been demoted, reinterpreted, or scrambled. As the religions of the ancient Near East changed, Yahwism rising in Israel, Zoroastrianism in Persia, Christianity spreading through the Roman world, earlier divine figures were sometimes reclassified. A storm god who once brought life-giving rain becomes, in a later story, a rebellious power who lashes the sea into chaos. A fertility deity associated with sexual ecstasy and agricultural abundance becomes a demon of lust and excess. Names drift across languages, A Canaanite or Mesopotamian divine title is heard, half-remembered centuries later, and folded into a new demonology as the personal name of a spirit. Local river or mountain beings become princes or dukes under Satan. Household sprites and bogies, long traded in oral lore, get caught in the scribal net and assigned to formal hierarchies. The result is a palimpsest. Under the Christian or Jewish demon lies an older spirit. Under that, perhaps, some fragment of landscape worship or clan ancestor veneration. The catalogues don't usually tell you this explicitly. They present their lists as straightforward information, but the faint echoes are there, audible to historians who compare phonetic forms and ritual functions across centuries. This too is a form of control through knowledge. By renaming an older god as a demon under Solomon's command, a text can make a theological point. The powers your neighbours worship are not peers of the Most High. They are rebellious servants at best, and even they can be compelled by the right ring, the right words, the right king. The storytelling function of the catalogues, then, is double. On one level, they reassure readers that their world, though haunted by invisible dangers, is not random. There is an order to the threats. They can be listed, ranked, paired with remedies. On another level, they dramatize the idea that knowledge itself is power. To know the true name of a spirit, the exact scope of its influence, the sign by which it must appear, is to have some leverage over it. Even to be able to say, this is not just bad luck, this is the work of such and such a demon, is to situate one's suffering in a larger narrative where heroes like Solomon have already been there, already interrogated that force and found its limit. For a person copying these texts in a dim room centuries ago, that might have been enough to make the night feel a little less vast. You could imagine that behind the chaos of plagues and famines, there was a kind of cosmic bureaucracy, fraught, dangerous, but intelligible. And at the top of that labyrinth of names stood a wise king with a ring, who had once turned even demons into data. In the next part of the story, the bureaucratic vision widens. The building of a single temple in Jerusalem becomes, in later imagination, a stage on which all these named forces appear, chained and conscripted, as if the work of laying stones on earth were also the work of reordering heaven and hell. If you follow the legend into the heart of Jerusalem, the demon lists stop feeling like abstract files and start to look like a cast list for a play. The set is the temple. Not just a building, but in ancient thought, the axis where heaven and earth touch. Even in the biblical text without a single demon in sight, the temple is not described as ordinary architecture. It is built to precise measurements. Its inner rooms are panelled with carved cherubim, palm trees and flowers. Gold overlays the walls, so that light from the lampstands turns the space into something like a contained sunrise. Ancient hearers didn't just see an impressive palace for a deity. They saw a model of the universe, the outer court where people moved and sacrificed, mapped onto the visible world of daily life. The inner sanctuary, darker and more restricted, echoed the hidden realm of angels and divine council. The Holy of Holies, entered only once a year by the high priest, symbolized the place beyond all worlds, the concentrated presence of God. When you build something like that, in a culture that thinks in symbols, you're not just stacking stone. You are making a claim about how reality is supposed to be organized, order pressed into wood grain and masonry. So when later stories say that demons showed up at the construction site, they are doing more than adding spooky colour. They are elaborating the idea that building the temple meant wrestling the entire universe into alignment. In the Testament of Solomon, this becomes literal. Solomon receives the ring, inscribed with the divine name. With it he can command spirits, he summons them one by one. And he doesn't just tell them to leave people alone. He puts them to work. Some are forced to cut stone in distant quarries. Others haul water. Some shape metal, move pillars, or lift impossibly heavy beams into place. A few are confined underground, compelled to support foundations or guard secret spaces. The temple rises in this telling because the very forces that once sabotaged human life have been chained into service. Construction becomes exorcism, and the finished building is not simply a house for God. It is a monument to the defeat and harnessing of chaos. That logic helps explain why demons enter the story in the first place. In a world where every major undertaking is fragile, where one storm, one disease outbreak, one political crisis can ruin years of planning, people are acutely aware of how easily big projects fail. Temples, palaces, city walls, irrigation systems, they all depend on good weather, peace, healthy workers, stable leadership. Any of those factors can suddenly go wrong. In that sense, demons are already there, whether named or not. Illness that sweeps the camp, a demon of plague, workers who grow listless or rebellious, a demon of sloth or strife, a stone that will not sit level no matter how often it is reset, a demon of confusion or obstruction. By putting literal demons into the narrative of the temple's construction, the story gives faces to all those points of failure. It imagines that every snag, every sabotage, every impurity that could disrupt a holy project is not random, but intentional. A being wants this to fail, and then it imagines a king who can look that being in the eye, ask for its name and say, "No, you will do the opposite. You will carry this stone. You will carve this block. You will help finish what you meant to ruin." At that level, the tale is satisfying. A fantasy of total control over everything that usually goes wrong. But the pattern goes wider than Jerusalem. If you look across cultures, big, sacred building projects are very often wrapped in stories about mastering the unseen. In Mesopotamia, temple foundations are sunk with carefully buried objects and inscribed tablets, meant to bind the underworld and secure the structure. Ritual texts speak to spirits of the ground, asking them not to rise up and crack the walls. Evil winds are invoked and dismissed before the first brick is laid. In Greek stories, city walls and great halls are sometimes built by semi-divine craftsmen or giants under compulsion, suggesting that otherworldly power has been bent, however uneasily, into human service. In medieval Europe, churches and bridges gather legends about restless spirits that must be paid or tricked. The first shadow to cross a threshold becomes a ghost bound to protect or haunt the place. A demon demands a soul in exchange for letting the structure stand. In parts of South and East Asia, there are elaborate rites to feed and pacify land spirits before a temple or palace rises, acknowledging that unseen beings inhabit the site and must be negotiated with if the building is to endure. The specific mythologies differ, but the underlying intuition is similar. When humans attempt something that will stand for generations, a temple, a royal tomb, a monumental bridge, they feel that they are trespassing into a domain where invisible forces have their own claims. To succeed, they must, in some fashion, make those forces cooperate. Solomon's demon builders are one version of that very old idea. They dramatize a proposition. A truly sacred building is one where the whole spectrum of reality, from angels down to the most disruptive spirits, has been brought under right order. There are other readings too, less cosmic and more political. On one level, the story reflects royal authority. Solomon, in the Bible, is already a figure of vast wealth and administrative skill. He organizes labor, imports materials, signs treaties with neighboring kings. He is the human center around which a complex project turns. In the later demon stories, that same organizing power extends beyond the visible world. Here is a king, so legitimate, so fully endorsed by heaven, that even the powers of darkness obey him. They carry stones like conscripted labourers. They fear his ring like subjects fear a royal seal. That theme can be read as a kind of royal propaganda in narrative form. If even demons must work on the temple, Who are you to resist the king's building programs, taxes, or religious reforms? At another level, the tale amplifies priestly authority. The temple is not just a royal showpiece. It is the center of sacrifice, law, and ritual purity. The presence of demons around its foundations and their binding under the divine name underline a message that priests and scribes would find useful. The rituals performed here are what keep the forces of chaos in check. Every sacrifice, every incense offering, every chant in the inner rooms becomes symbolically a maintenance action on that original cosmic construction site. The priests stand in Solomon's place, wielding inherited knowledge of names and procedures to ensure that what was once bound stays bound. The theological messaging is embedded in the architecture itself. A space ordered according to divine instruction, guarded by carved cherubim, shielded by layers of increasing holiness, says in stone and gold what the demon lists say in ink. The universe is not an even battlefield. There is a top and there is a bottom. There is a Most High and there are lesser powers, some obedient, some rebellious, but all ultimately circumscribed. To walk through such a building in your imagination is to move from the outer world of mixed purity and danger, step by step, into a center where, in theory, no demon can intrude. And yet, in the Testament, they are still there, in the walls, under the floors, pressed into service. That tension is part of the drama. The building is holy, but its holiness is not naive. It is achieved, defended, enforced. The ring, the names, the binding. These are tools to maintain a fragile order in a universe that always threatens to relapse into chaos. For listeners in late antiquity or the Middle Ages, hearing or reading such stories, the temple stands as both a memory and an ideal. A time when the world's dangers were not just feared, but confronted and drafted. A place where political power, priestly ritual, and cosmic hierarchy seemed to line up perfectly. And behind it all, the quiet suggestion that knowledge of structures, of names, of limits, is what lets you build something stable in a world of unseen hammers. In the next turn of the story, those tools become even more intricate. If demons and temples are part of the same cosmic construction project, then so are angels and the sacred syllables that command them. The ring on Solomon's hand is only as strong as the names it bears, and later writers will devote enormous care to imagining how those names work. In the world that produced the Testament of Solomon and its cousins, names are never just labels. To know the name of a being is to know where it fits. Within a family, within a bureaucracy, within a map of the invisible. Late antique magic leans hard on this idea. When a text has Solomon question each demon, "Who are you? What is your function? What angel thwarts you?" It isn't idle interrogation. It is classification. A demon who admits "I am the one who causes headaches" has been narrowed. He is no longer an undefined threat. He belongs to the category of afflictions. A spirit who confesses "I stir up jealousy between spouses" is placed under domestic strife. Once situated, each power can be matched to an opposite, a virtue, a prayer, an angelic name. This is the logic behind the often dry-sounding catalogues. They read, at first glance, like phone books of the uncanny. But underneath is a conviction that if you can list all the parts of the system, you can learn to navigate it. In some texts, that system is almost judicial. Demons are arraigned like defendants. Solomon demands their names, their crimes, their jurisdictions. They, in turn, are compelled to reveal under which higher authority they operate, and under which higher authority they must yield. That higher authority is usually angelic. One of the stranger features of Solomonic stories is how seldom Solomon is shown commanding purely in his own right. He has the ring, he has royal status. But he habitually leans on something above him, the name of God and the names of angels. The pattern goes like this. A demon is summoned. He resists, blusters, boasts. Solomon presses him, "By which angel are you opposed?" Cornered, the demon answers with a name often unfamiliar to us now, a composite of Hebrew and Greek syllables, sometimes a garbled echo of a biblical figure, sometimes something that seems entirely invented. Once that angel is named, the script flips. Solomon, or the ritual expert reading the text centuries later, can call on that angel in turn. The demon knows that somewhere in a higher court there is a being authorized to overrule him. If that authority is invoked correctly, the demon's will collapses. Angels in this framework are not only messengers, they are mediators and supervisors. They form a chain between the distant, unseeable God and the messy world of human ailments and temptations. Each one specializes: an angel of healing, an angel of fire, an angel who binds lust, an angel who governs Mars or Saturn. Their names become handle points on the machinery of the cosmos. You can feel in these lists the influence of late antique bureaucracy. Empires run on officials, sub-officials, clerks, regional governors, each with a title and a sphere of authority. To get something done, you rarely petition the emperor directly. You address the correct office, the proper intermediary. Solomonic magic takes that familiar pattern and extends it upward. To know that a particular demon is under the watch of, say, the angel Michael, or a more obscure figure with a long, vowel-heavy name, is to have found the cosmic department that can discipline him. But the power of the system doesn't stop at identification. It depends on performance. Grimoire-style operations, those handbook rituals attributed to Solomon in the centuries after the Testament, wrap this play of names in layers of action and timing. A typical ceremony begins with purification. The practitioner prays, fasts, perhaps washes in running water. This is not only hygiene, it is alignment. You are trying to make yourself fit for contact with powers that, on the angelic side at least, are imagined as burning with purity. Then come fumigations, incense, herbs, resins burnt, so that the air thickens with fragrant smoke. Different recipes claim different effects. Some scents are said to attract spirits of a certain planet, others to repel hostile presences. The smoke itself becomes a medium in which names can be written, however briefly, with breath and gesture. Inscriptions follow. On parchment, on wax, on metal plates, the practitioner traces circles, crosses, stars, sigils. At the centre or the rim, divine and angelic names are written in stylized scripts. Sometimes Hebrew letters are copied without full understanding. Sometimes Greek or Latin words are compressed into strings that feel more like sound than language. The idea is consistent. Inscribe the right names in the right shapes, and you create a bounded space. Within that boundary, the normal rules of vulnerability are supposed to soften. The magician stands, symbolically, under the protection of the higher powers whose names are now etched around him. Even time is treated as something that can be tuned. Operations are scheduled by planetary hours and days. A demon associated with Mars is summoned on a Tuesday, in a Mars hour, under a sky where the red planet is rising or strong. An angel of Venus is approached on a Friday, at dawn or dusk. The assumption is that the whole cosmos pulses with rhythms, and that certain currents are more favourable than others. To use them is not exactly to override the universe, but to catch it at a moment when your call is more likely to go through. All of this can sound far removed from religious exorcism, as it appears in more straightforward liturgies. In Jewish and Christian prayers for deliverance, the emphasis tends to fall less on timing, symbols, or planetary hours, and more on trust and authority. A demon is adjured in the name of God or Christ or the Holy Spirit, often with scriptural phrases quoted aloud. The exorcist may fast or pray, but the stress is on humility, confession, and reliance on mercy rather than on technical exactitude. There is overlap. Some late antique amulets, meant as pious objects, contain long strings of angel names. Some synagogue inscriptions mention protective watchers. Early Christian texts speak of calling on the name of the Lord almost as if it were a charm. But the grimoire tradition pushes in a different direction, where liturgical exorcism is framed as asking a higher power to intervene. Grimoires increasingly describe procedures by which a knowledgeable person can, if properly prepared, compel spirits to appear, bargain, and obey. That shift introduces a moral tension. On one hand, many rituals insist on the magician's devotion. They prescribe confession of sins, almsgiving, strict adherence to commandments. They warn that anyone impure who presumes to summon spirits without true faith will be torn apart, deceived, or driven mad. Devotion in that sense functions as armour. Obedience to God is what keeps the operator from being swallowed by the forces he calls up. The angels are not vending machines. They are guardians who will only cooperate if the human approaches in reverence. On the other hand, the goals of these operations are often frankly pragmatic. Find treasure, gain knowledge of hidden things, win favour, heal an illness, inflame or cool someone's love, compel a spirit to build, destroy, spy, or teach. This is not simply asking for protection, it is trying to steer events. And so, within the same manuscripts, you find prayers that sound like ordinary piety, psalms of repentance, invocations of divine mercy, side by side with meticulous instructions for drawing circles and threatening demons with angelic names if they do not comply. The devout language is real. The power-seeking is real. The two sit uneasily together. For some, there was no contradiction. If God is king of the cosmos, and angels are his servants, then learning to work with that hierarchy might be seen as learning to live in tune with creation. To bring a demon to heel is, in this view, to participate in the ongoing enforcement of order. For others, especially later theologians, the whole enterprise looked suspect. They worried that fascination with names and techniques could eclipse obedience, that a person might treat the divine not as a mystery to be trusted, but as a mechanism to be exploited, that behind the recitation of angel names, the real devotion was not to God but to control itself. The Solomonic legends sit right on that fault line. Solomon is portrayed as a servant of the Most High, wielding power only because God permits it. Yet he is also the archetypal master of secret names, the king whose ring and words bend the entire invisible world around a human project. For listeners half asleep with the story, there is a lingering question in that image. Is the ring an icon of faith, or a tool of ambition? Is the knowledge of names a form of reverence, learning the grammar of creation, or a temptation to treat the universe as something that can be forced to answer? The later history of Solomonic books will keep circling those questions, even as the lists grow longer, and the rituals more elaborate. In the next phase of the legend, the ring passes from temple lore into the thick, dog-eared manuals of medieval practitioners, and Solomon's angels and demons acquire whole new careers on the shelves of scribes, monks, and curious laypeople. The bridge between late antiquity and the medieval grimoires is not a single line. It is more like a braided river, splitting and rejoining as it runs through languages, scriptoria, and changing ideas of what counted as acceptable knowledge. The earliest Solomonic texts we've been talking about, the Testament of Solomon, adjurations in Greek magical papyri, Jewish and Christian exorcistic formulas, circulated in a world where Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, and later Latin shared space. A charm might begin life in a Jewish setting, using the divine name in Hebrew. It might be copied by a Greek-speaking scribe who transliterates those names into Greek letters. Then, centuries later, it might be picked up by a Latin copyist who preserves the strange syllables without really knowing what they mean. At each stage, details shift. A Hebrew angel name is misread as 2 or 3 names. A Greek phrase describing a demon's function is mistaken for part of its proper title. Marginal notes by some practical-minded reader: this spirit heals fevers. This one brings money, slide into the main text in the next copy, hardening into supposed tradition. By the early Middle Ages, much of this material has become scattered. Bits of Solomonic lore appear in homilies warning against magic. Some show up in lists of forbidden books. A few survive on amulets and little scrolls tucked into pendants, where Solomon's name and a handful of angels are invoked to guard against nightmares, illness, or the evil eye. The chain is fragile, but it doesn't break. In the Latin West, the Bible itself provides a fixed anchor. Solomon as the wise king, the temple builder, the figure associated with wisdom literature. Around that anchor, scraps of older magical tradition drift. A story about Solomon commanding demons, originally told in Greek, is retold in Latin. A Jewish legend about his ring crosses into Christian collections of pious tales. Somewhere, in the margins of monastic libraries, anonymous compilers begin to gather these fragments. The result, over time, is what we now call the Solomonic grimoire family. The best-known member of this family is the Key of Solomon, or Clavicula Salomonis in Latin. It presents itself as a handbook written by Solomon himself, supposedly copied from a book that had been hidden in his tomb and miraculously recovered. Historically, that isn't what happened. Most scholars today think the Key of Solomon was compiled in the later Middle Ages, probably in Italy or a nearby Latin Christian context, drawing on older Jewish and Arabic materials as well as Latin exorcistic traditions. The oldest surviving manuscripts are relatively late, and they already show signs of long copying and rearrangement. But in the fiction of the text, you are reading Solomon's own voice. He addresses a "my son," often imagined as Roboam or Rehoboam, and explains how to prepare oneself, how to engrave pentacles, how to summon spirits safely. The tone is paternal and royal, a king of Israel instructing his heir in the hidden wisdom that undergirds the visible kingdom. Alongside the key, there are other works that orbit the same mythic centre. There is the Lesser Key of Solomon, or Lemegeton, a composite text put together in the early modern period from earlier medieval sources. It is actually a collection of several books: the Ars Goetia, concerned with 72 spirits, the Ars Theurgia Goetia, dealing with aerial spirits of the directions, the Ars Paulina and Ars Almadel, focused on angelic hierarchies and planetary rulers, and the Ars Notoria, a curious text promising perfect memory and learning through divine prayer. There are still more: the so-called Fourth and Fifth Books of Solomon, the Testament in later Latin dress, and numerous shorter rituals that claim to transmit a little key, a secret of secrets, or a book of conjurations once held by the king. These texts do not form a single neat line of dissent. They quote each other, contradict each other, duplicate passages with minor changes. Some are clearly Christian, others show Jewish or Islamic influence. Many are mixtures where a Latin prayer to the Trinity sits beside names with Hebrew shapes and planetary diagrams drawn from Arabic astrology. What ties them together under the Solomonic label is less exact genealogy and more imaginative framework. In all of them, Solomon stands as the archetypal authority behind ritual knowledge, the one human to whom God supposedly entrusted the full map of angels and demons. One of the things medieval and early modern compilers do with that map is systematize it in ways late antique texts only hinted at. Where the Testament of Solomon gives us a somewhat scattered procession of spirits, each introduced in turn, later grimoires arrange spirits into ranks and offices. Demons become kings, princes, dukes, marquises, earls, presidents, often echoing the feudal and courtly structures familiar to the compilers. In the Goetic tradition, the famous 72 spirits are assigned precise numbers, 1 to 72. Each entry follows a pattern. You are told the spirit's name, its title and rank, the form it appears in, what it can teach or grant, which king or cardinal direction it serves under, what seal or sigil represents it, and under which conditions you should summon it. Seals are a new emphasis here. Instead of relying solely on the spoken and written names, grimoires provide little symbolic diagrams, often circular, composed of lines, hooks, and curls. These are said to be the spirit's character or mark, something like a signature. The magician is instructed to draw this seal on parchment, wear it as a layman on the chest, or place it within the magic circle. The logic is not entirely foreign to late antiquity. Amulets and inscribed names are already there, but in medieval and early modern hands the practice becomes highly codified. Angel hierarchies are treated in the same way. Texts like parts of the Lemegeton or related manuals break the heavens into layers. Angels of the days of the week, angels of the hours, angels of the winds, angels of the planets, and zodiac signs. Each has a name, a seal, sometimes a list of subordinate spirits. Rituals specify which angel to call when, what incense to burn, what psalms to recite. You can feel the influence of scholastic thought and canon law in the background. The invisible world is described almost like a legal system. Spirits are not just raw forces, they hold offices, jurisdiction, and chain of command relationships. A demon is a rebel, yes, but even rebels in this system are mapped. They are fallen angels, and so they still have a place in the larger order. Christian theology reshapes the earlier material here. By the Middle Ages, the dominant Christian view sees demons primarily as fallen angels who chose against God and are now fixed in their rebellion. Any interaction with them is dangerous. Yet the same theology also insists that all spirits, even the fallen, remain subject to God's ultimate sovereignty. Grimoires lean on that. Conjurations constantly state that the operator is not commanding on his own authority, but by the power of God, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, by the merits of Christ's passion, by the intercession of saints, and the commanding presence of archangels. Demons are told that they must obey not because the magician is strong, but because a divine court has already condemned them, and refusal would only increase their torment. The language is legalistic. Spirits are cited, constrained, adjured, bound by oath. They are ordered to appear without guile, without delay, without deception, under penalty of further punishment in the lake of fire or by the sword of Michael. The magician stands, at least in theory, as an officer executing prior heavenly judgments. In that sense, the whole ritual is framed as an enforcement action. The circle is the courtroom. The names of God and angels are the writ and seal. The demon is the reluctant witness, compelled to testify, to reveal secrets and perform tasks under strict conditions. At the same time, there is an undeniable borrowing from older non-Christian strands, planetary magic, astrological timing, names that seem more Jewish or esoteric than churchly. The result is a layered tradition where Christian reinterpretation sits over, and sometimes awkwardly beside, older ideas. And throughout, the attributions remain bold and anachronistic. The Key of Solomon speaks as if Solomon wrote Latin in a medieval hand. The Lemegeton presents spirit lists that likely coalesced 1,000 years after his historical lifetime, yet still claims to be his work. The Ars Notoria offers complex Latin prayers to the Trinity, while asserting that they were revealed to Solomon by an angel. Historically, we are looking at a long process. Anonymous clerics, scholars and practitioners in late antiquity, the early medieval period, and the high Middle Ages, borrowing from Jewish recipes, Greek magical papyri, Syriac charms, Arabic astrological manuals, and local folk practice, fold their sources together and smooth them under the name of Solomon. They do this in part for authority. A book of spells written by unknown monk of the 13th century would carry little weight. A book of sacred operations dictated by the wisest king in Scripture, whose stories already linked him with demons and angels, could be imagined as ancient, venerable, and therefore powerful. At the same time, the name of Solomon functions as a kind of shield. To present a ritual as the wisdom of Solomon is to argue, implicitly, that it is aligned with divine order, not opposed to it. That calling spirits, if done in this authorized way, is not sorcery and rebellion against God, but the dignified use of a gift once entrusted to Israel's greatest king. From a distance of centuries the seams show, we can see the late antique core shining through, the medieval Christian overlay, the bureaucratic impulse to catalogue and rank, the practical urge to turn scattered legends into step-by-step instructions. We can also see how much has been lost. Earlier versions alternate lists, local adaptations that never made it into the manuscripts that survived. Yet the fiction holds for readers and practitioners across the later Middle Ages and into the early modern world. These volumes are not patchworks. They are keys, Solomon's keys, to a universe where every spirit, whether angelic or demonic, has a name, a seal, a rank, and a place in a legal order that reaches from the throne of God down to the narrow chalk circle drawn on a wooden floor in the middle of the night. In the next turn of the story, one part of this sprawling family will come to dominate popular imagination. A compact, unsettling catalogue of 72 spirits, each with a sigil and a function, gathered under the title of the Goetia. When people today talk about Solomon and the 72 demons, they are almost always, whether they know it or not, talking about one particular book, the Ars Goetia, the first part of the Lemma Gittin, or Lesser Key of Solomon. This is not the oldest Solomonic text. It is not the most complex. It is, however, the most cinematic. It reads like someone took the scattered spirits of earlier traditions, marched them into a line, and gave each one a number, a uniform, and a job description. In the Ars Goetia, the spirit world is not a vague swarm of night terrors. It's an administration. There are kings, ruling over large portions of the invisible realm. Under them are dukes, marquises, earls, presidents, princes, knights. Each rank comes with a certain number of legions, a sense of military structure. A king might command dozens of legions of subordinate spirits. A lesser officer might command fewer. This is feudal Europe projected onto the unseen. The first spirit, Baal, is called a king. The second, Agares, a duke. Vasael is a duke. Beleth is a king, and so on, all the way down to the 72nd spirit, Andromalius, who is listed as an earl. Each entry gives you the name, the title, the number of legions, and which of the 4 great kings of the directions they are said to obey. The language is cool and matter-of-fact, where the Testament of Solomon spends time on stories, how a demon tormented a boy, how Solomon interrogated it. The Goetia is closer to a directory or a technical manual. This spirit appears in such and such form. He teaches these sciences, reveals these secrets, brings this kind of luck, destroys this kind of enemy. Then comes a short recipe, what words to say, what tools to hold, what seal to display. That structure is part of why the book feels persuasive. Each spirit has a sigil, usually a small abstract drawing, the seal that supposedly embodies its name and authority. The operator is told to inscribe this seal carefully on virgin parchment within a certain hour, surrounded by the right divine names. The seal is then used as a kind of legal mark, a contract token that binds the summoned spirit to appear and to serve. Names, titles, seals, ranks, legions. It reads like a personnel file or a set of military orders rather than a folktale. In a world used to charters, heraldry, and coats of arms, that kind of bureaucratic tone could be very convincing. The promises help too. Most entries in the Ars Goetia offer very specific outcomes. This spirit will help you find lost treasures. That one teaches rhetoric and gives you a good reputation. Another can reconcile friends and enemies, inflame love, or stir up hatred. Some promise the favour of nobles, or the quick delivery of answers to questions put at a distance. Others offer knowledge of all sciences or understanding of animals or insight into past and future. Compared to the more moralizing tone of many Christian texts, this is starkly practical. You are not told to become holy. You are told if you follow these steps, a particular spirit will produce a particular result. The book speaks in the language of cause and effect, elaborate ritual causes, and very tangible human desires as effects. This does not mean anyone who copied it believed all those promises literally. But the way the text is written, with its consistency and detail, mimics seriousness. It sounds like a body of case law where centuries of sporadic experiments have been boiled down into rules. If you want this, call that spirit in this way, watching out for that danger. When you set the Ars Goetia beside the Testament of Solomon, the family resemblance and the differences both stand out. In the Testament, Solomon is a narrator. He tells you how he received the ring, how he questions each demon, learns its name, its function, the angel that can bind it, and the bodily illness or human sin it causes. The tone is half moral lesson, half wonder story. The demons confess their weakness. Solomon sends them off to work on the temple or to be restrained by angels. The aim on the surface is edifying. You learn that demons cause specific kinds of suffering, that they are limited, that divine authority can curb them. The story reinforces a theological point. Evil spirits are real, but God's order stands above them. The Goetia, by contrast, barely mentions the temple, and only glancingly invokes Solomon himself. His name anchors the book, but he is not a character in it. There is no running courtroom scene. Instead, the text offers a framework. You, the reader, are in Solomon's position. You stand in the circle, armed with divine names and pentacles, confronting a structured list of spirits who, we are told, once bowed to Solomon's seal and now can be compelled in his name. The thematic overlap is there. Both traditions imagine an ordered cosmos in which demons have particular roles. Both insist that they can be named, classified, and compelled by higher authority. Both connect their binding to a larger project. In the Testament, the building of the temple. In the Goetia, the implicit construction of the magician's desired reality, knowledge, influence, wealth, protection. But the names themselves are often different. A few echoes exist. Figures like Asmodeus or Belial drift through many demonological traditions, but the specific 72 of the Ars Goetia do not simply march out of the Testament of Solomon in a new uniform. They seem to be drawn from multiple sources: older demon lists, astrological spirits, local lore, perhaps misheard or mistranscribed names from Jewish and Arabic texts. Scholars see similar functions repeating: a spirit that teaches astronomy, a spirit that finds treasure, a spirit who stirs up love, a spirit who destroys enemies. These jobs appear in various magical manuals, sometimes under different names. The Ars Goetia looks in many ways like a late attempt to collate and standardize a floating cloud of earlier spirits and functions into a clean table of 72. Why that number? We saw earlier that 72 is a charged number in biblical and post-biblical tradition, linked with the nations, the languages, the elders of Israel, the supposed divisions of the divine name. The Testament of Solomon is already playing with the idea of a complete set of demonic powers under Solomon's control. The Goetia goes further and nails the number down. 72, no more, no less. In doing so, it gives later readers the sense that they are looking at a whole map, a complete registry of the major infernal officials, all of them once subdued by the wise king and now accessible through his lesser key. Tracing the exact origin of this list, however, is difficult. The Lemegeton manuscripts we possess are relatively late, 17th century, and after, though they probably draw on earlier medieval and perhaps Renaissance materials. The spirits' names shift between copies. Some seals vary. The order changes. A few parallel lists, outside the Solomonic label, share names or functions, suggesting borrowing back and forth. Rather than a single author sitting down and inventing 72 demons all at once, it is more likely that the Ars Goetia crystallized gradually. Compilers in different times and places folded together older catalogues, standardizing where they could, harmonizing rank titles with familiar feudal models, and framing the whole under Solomon's name because that was the established way to give such a book weight. Whatever its exact path, the result has been extraordinarily influential. Modern occult movements, fantasy fiction, manga, anime, games, and internet lore have taken the Goetic 72 as a ready-made demonology. Their sigils are reproduced on posters and pendants. Their names are reused as characters and monsters. For many people now, this is what Solomon's Demons means, a numbered list with sharp-edged seals and carefully worded powers. Behind that modern image, though, lie centuries of drift and reshaping. The Ars Goetia does not erase the Testament of Solomon or the earlier Jewish, Christian, and Near Eastern traditions. It sits on top of them, one more layer in the sediment, giving a rigid shape to ideas that were once looser, more fluid, more story-driven. To understand what any of this might tell us about real history, we have to step back from the seals and ranks and ask a quieter question. What were people actually doing, and fearing, and hoping for, when they copied these lists and told these stories about Solomon and his 72 spirits? One way to answer that question is to take Solomon and his demons and turn them on their side. Instead of asking, did this really happen? We ask, what kind of text is this? What work is it doing for the people who used it? That's where the scholars come in, with their different toolkits. A literary critic reads the Testament of Solomon, or the Goetia, like a strange short story collection. They look at structure, motifs, recurring images. They notice that in the Testament, nearly every demon scene follows a pattern. Appearance, boast, confession, subjugation. It looks like a ritual drama written down. The story is almost liturgical. You name the spirit. It admits what harm it causes. It yields to a stronger name. In that reading, Solomon's ring and his courtroom are not the minutes of a royal trial. They are a narrative way of thinking about inner and outer chaos. Each demon becomes an episode in a larger argument. Fear has a name, temptation has a name, illness has a name, and things with names can be bound. Historians of religion come at the same material from another angle. They map texts onto the worlds that produced them. The Testament of Solomon probably grew in a late antique environment, full of Jewish and Christian exorcists, Greek magical papyri, and temple medicine. In that setting, a story about a king who commands demons sounds less like fantasy and more like a mythologized version of things people saw around them. Healers reciting psalms, scribes writing amulets, priests chanting over the sick. Anthropologists of magic widen the frame again. They notice how often stories like this appear in many cultures far from Jerusalem. A hero or saint who learns the names of spirits. A specialist who draws a circle, recites a formula, and drives out an afflicting presence. A powerful ancestor who once tamed the wild forces that still threaten the village, the family, the body. Solomon fits that pattern neatly. In this view, demon command is not primarily about metaphysics. It is about managing anxiety when a child has nightmares, when a field fails, when a sudden stroke leaves someone paralyzed. People want a script. They want a story in which invisible harm is not random, but personal, addressable, negotiable. Literary criticism, history of religion, and anthropology overlap on one point. They all treat these demon stories as cultural technologies, not proofs that Solomon literally supervised 72 supernatural bureaucrats, but tools for talking about power and danger, for teaching values, for giving people a way to act in situations where they might otherwise feel helpless. From that perspective, the word command starts to look flexible. Sometimes it really does mean exorcistic command. The Testament describes Solomon driving demons out of people or forcing them into tasks. That lines up with late antique exorcism rituals where a healer speaks in the name of a higher power and orders the spirit to leave. The legend magnifies a familiar religious action by projecting it backwards onto a legendary king. But command can also mean something more symbolic. Think of a person reciting a psalm over and over, or carrying an amulet inscribed with a name. To an anthropologist, this is a way of externalizing psychological struggle. The demon is not only an outside being, it is also the shape you give to grief, anger, addiction, intrusive thoughts. Learning the name, learning the remedy, is a kind of mental organization. You are turning a swirl of feelings into a figure you can confront. In that sense, to command a demon can mean to achieve some mastery over a recurring problem, using ritual as a scaffold. Ritual performance adds another layer. Many of the Solomonic manuals read like scripts for a very specific kind of theatre. There is a stage, the magic circle, there are props, the ring, the seal, the sword, the incense. There are costumes, the special garments. There is a carefully choreographed set of lines, spoken in order. For the performer, the power of this is not necessarily in any supernatural result. It is in the way the ritual focuses attention, slows down time, and gives the sense that something consequential is happening. That can change how you feel, how you decide, how you relate to your fears. The demon is commanded because the practitioner has moved into a role where they are not simply a victim of events. They are an operator following a script backed by Solomon himself. From the outside, a historian might call that placebo or performance. From the inside, for someone copying the book by candlelight, it was a way to feel that even the most intractable troubles had a procedure attached to them, a sequence of actions that, if not guaranteed to work, at least made the chaos legible. There is also a social side to all this. Demon stories can reinforce norms. In the Testament, many demons are linked to specific sins: lust, pride, deceit, violence. Solomon's questions and their confessions turn moral teaching into a kind of cosmic criminal record. If you do this, that demon has you. The cure is obedience to God, or use of the right divine names. The story nudges listeners towards certain behaviours and away from others, using the fear and fascination of spirits as leverage. In later grimoires, the dynamic changes but doesn't disappear. The Goetia is far less moralizing, yet it still encodes social desires. Many spirits promise promotion, favour, reconciliation, eloquence before powerful people. That tells you something about the readers. They were moving in worlds where patronage, rhetoric, and reputation mattered intensely. Commanding demons becomes a metaphor for navigating courts, guilds, and precarious careers. If you can't control your lord or your employer, perhaps you can at least follow a ritual that promises some influence at a distance. Why did such texts survive then? They were not cheap curios. Copying a manuscript took time, skill, and resources. A text tended to live on only if someone thought it worth preserving. Practical usefulness is one reason. A handbook that promised cures, protection, or advantage could be passed from practitioner to apprentice, guarded as a family treasure, tucked into the back of a more respectable devotional volume. Even if only a few people in each generation actually used the rituals, they might value the book as a last resort, an occult toolkit to be opened when ordinary prayers and medicines had failed. Curiosity played a role too. Clerics, scholars, and lay readers often collected odd texts the way some people today collect strange websites or obscure manuals. A Solomonic book with its aura of ancient wisdom and dangerous knowledge could be something to read in secret, to mention in a whisper, to copy because it was fascinating, even if one never intended to draw the circle oneself. There was also prestige Attaching Solomon's name to a work made it sound old, authoritative, halfway between scripture and rumour. Owning such a book could flatter the possessor. Here was access to a hidden tradition, a key not available to the ordinary believer. In a manuscript culture where libraries were small and books were rare, even a single copy could shape the imagination of a monastery, a court, or a city for centuries. And then there is the way manuscript culture itself works. Texts don't survive or vanish in neat lines. They drift. A few folios get bound into a larger collection. A scribe copies a page because the marginal drawings catch their eye. A later owner underlines a passage on a demon who finds lost goods. Because they have just lost something, tiny unrecorded decisions add up. What we now call the Solomonic tradition is partly design, but partly the accident of which pages happened to be recopied when others crumbled. Modern skeptical readings try to be honest about this patchiness. They can tell you that a given section of the Testament looks like a Christian interpolation, or that a certain Goetic seal first appears in a 15th century handbook. They can sketch plausible lines of influence, Jewish angelology flowing into Greek magical papyri, filtered through Arabic occult science, reframed in Latin under Solomon's name. But beyond a certain point, the trail goes dim. We don't know exactly who first decided there should be 72 demons rather than 70 or 80. We don't know which real healers or frustrated petitioners stood behind any given ritual in the Goetia. We can't say with certainty how many people believed literally in every detail, and how many treated the whole thing as symbolic performance or hopeful experiment. For a historian, that uncertainty is not a flaw to be removed. It is part of the truth. Solomon and his demons live in the space between experience and story, between fear and the patterns we draw to make fear manageable. The surviving texts give us a few carefully inked outlines of that process, but a great deal of the colour is gone. So when we listen to these legends in the dark, we are not only hearing about a king and his ring, we are also hearing echoes of unnamed scribes and quiet practitioners, each trying, in their own way, to put a frame around the invisible. Once you see Solomon as a kind of cultural technology, it becomes easier to understand what happened next. He doesn't stay put in one text or even in one religion. He turns into a shared figure that different communities can pick up, reshape, and set back down to do new work. In Jewish tradition, Solomon's reputation as a wise judge and temple builder remains central, but the demon-taming king lurks just under the surface. Rabbinic stories talk about him knowing the language of animals, commanding spirits to help build the temple, even losing his throne for a while when a powerful being tricks him and takes the ring. These tales are not solemn doctrine, they are midrash and folklore, a way of exploring questions about pride, repentance, and the dangers of overreaching. A brilliant king who can talk to birds and rule over demons is also a king who can fall very far. In Christian imagination, Solomon becomes a kind of prefigure of Christ and the Church. Medieval sermons point to his wisdom, his building of a house for God, his famous judgment between the two women as signs of a deeper spiritual wisdom fulfilled later. Side by side with that, you find the other Solomon, the magician king. Monks copy exorcistic prayers of Solomon, artists paint him with a ring or a scepter, and vernacular legends quietly embellish his power over unclean spirits. For most believers, this sits in a grey zone. Not exactly official teaching, not exactly forbidden, more like a reservoir of stories that can be drawn on for preaching, for warnings, for wonder. In Islam-adjacent folklore, he takes on a still more dramatic role. The Quran itself presents Suleiman as a prophet king who commands the winds, understands the speech of birds, and rules over jinn by permission of God. Later storytellers elaborate that picture. In Arabic and Persian tales, he sits at the centre of a cosmic administration. Jinn and animals report to him like officials. He travels across the world on the back of the wind. Cities and palaces rise under his direction. Here, too, a ring and a seal appear, but their message is different, not private magic, but delegated authority. Whatever he does by God's leave. For Muslim audiences, that distinction matters. It turns a potentially suspect wonder worker into an exemplar of obedience and divinely sanctioned justice. Across these traditions, Solomon becomes extraordinarily flexible. He can be the ultra-orthodox sage, the slightly dangerous magician, the stern prophet, the tragic figure who loses everything and then returns. Communities can emphasize or suppress different parts of the legend depending on what they need. In times of anxiety about magic, the demon stories recede and the wise teacher comes to the front. In times when people are terrified of possession, the exorcist and master of spirits steps forward again. The same flexibility shows up in the symbols attached to his name. Think of the Seal of Solomon. At first, this is not a specific geometric pattern so much as a concept, the sign by which he commands spirits. Later, it condenses into images. In some manuscripts and amulets, the seal is a hexagram, 2 interlocking triangles that many people today associate with Jewish identity. In others, especially in Western esoteric traditions, the Seal of Solomon can be a pentagram, a 5-pointed star, or an elaborate talisman stuffed with letters and names. The meanings shift as the shapes travel. In some medieval Jewish contexts, a hexagram used as Solomon's seal might function as a protective emblem, inscribed on rings or doorways as a ward against harm. In Christian Europe, a pentagram linked to Solomon could symbolize Christ's 5 wounds, or simply act as a generic sign of good magic, a safe counter to demonic forces. In Islamic amulet culture, complex Solomonic seals are drawn with Quranic verses and divine names, folded into packets, sewn into clothing, worn against the evil eye. The same basic idea, a king's sign that spirits must obey, adapts itself to very different theological landscapes. The ring follows a similar path. Sometimes it is a simple metal ring with the name of God engraved. Sometimes it carries strange characters or miniature diagrams. Sometimes its power lies in the material, iron against jinn, silver against certain demons. In legend, losing the ring means losing control. In material culture, wearing a ring of Solomon means hoping for some small share of that control, over illness, over envy, over unseen threats. Jewelers, scribes, and storytellers all collaborate, unwittingly, to keep the object alive. By the time of the Renaissance, all of this becomes raw material for a new kind of project. Humanist scholars and occult philosophers start combing through Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Arabic texts, looking for hidden correspondences. They are fascinated by the idea that there is an ancient Prisca theologia, a single primordial wisdom behind all traditions. Under that lens, Solomon turns into an ideal patron for learned magic. If there really is a universal science of spirits and signs, who better to embody it than the king who supposedly ruled both angels and demons? Renaissance grimoires take scattered Solomonic elements, names, seals, ritual phrases, and reorganize them into systems. What had been loose collections of legends and spells hardens into tables, lists, and hierarchies. Spirits are ranked, numbered, given precise offices. Symbols are standardized and sharpened. The ring and seal become part of a kit that includes specialized garments, timing by planetary hours, elaborate circles drawn on the floor. Later esoteric movements build on this further. Freemasons, ceremonial magicians, Rosicrucians, and occult revivalists borrow Solomonic imagery to suggest ancient lineage and hidden knowledge, even when they are inventing much of it anew. The echo of all this reaches into modern popular culture almost unnoticed. When a fantasy story introduces a grimoire bound in dark leather, full of sigils and names you shouldn't pronounce aloud, it is drawing on centuries of Solomonic association. When a video game or anime presents a menu of ranked demons, each with its own seal and specialty, that structure owes something to the Goetia and its cousins. Lists of 72 spirits, or 72 anything, are instantly evocative because they hint at completeness, at a secret catalogue that maps what is otherwise unmanageable. Even outside overtly occult themes, the pattern survives. Self-help books promise 7 laws or 12 rules for life. Conspiracy lore circulates diagrams of hidden cabals. Productivity systems offer bullet-pointed methods for taming your inbox. They do not mention Solomon, but they inherit his logic. Take something vast and unruly. Give it names, numbers, symbols, and procedures. Turn the formless into a list you can hold in your hand. Behind the pentagrams and hexagrams, the rings and forbidden books, there is a quieter continuity. People keep coming back to Solomon because he occupies a crossroads, between wisdom and power, between piety and danger, between order and the chaos he claims to bind. When you trace his afterlife through art, folklore, and modern culture, you are really watching different societies negotiating the same questions. How much control do we want? How much control do we think is possible? When we whisper about demon lists or copy protective seals, are we chasing raw power, asking for protection, or trying to impose some kind of order on a world that feels too big and too strange? Most of the time, it is probably all three at once. The legend of Solomon gives that mixture a face, a ring, and a set of names. It lets us imagine that somewhere just beyond the edge of sight, there is a throne room where even the darkest forces sit in rows, answer when called, and go where they are sent. The stories promise that the chaos has a shape, whether or not anyone ever wore that original ring. The promise itself has been enough to keep Solomon walking through our art, our tales, and our restless, ordering minds. If you pull back from the details for a moment, the rings and seals, the grimoires and jinn courts, a clearer pattern starts to emerge. Historically, the safest thing to say is not that Solomon actually commanded 72 specific demons, neatly listed and ranked, but that his name became a kind of tool. At the beginning, there is just a king with a reputation for extraordinary judgment, building a temple that marks the boundary between the human and the divine. Over time, that reputation thickens. The wise judge becomes the archetypal expert in dealing with whatever you cannot see but deeply fear. Spirits, curses, illness, misfortune, the sense that your life is being shaped by forces you can't control. Instead of saying, "Someone came up with this spell in a village last year," a text can say, "Solomon did this." Instead of admitting, "We made this diagram yesterday because the world feels scary," an amulet can say, "This is the seal that once ruled even the darkest beings." His name becomes a label that makes new practices feel old, local fears feel part of a larger story. The number 72 fits into that process as a kind of late crystallization, not an original fact. Earlier Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions remember Solomon as wise, as favoured, as powerful, sometimes as a master of spirits, but they do not converge on that exact list. The crisp catalogue of 72 demons that people quote today mostly comes from much later ritual handbooks, especially the Goetia and related grimoires. Writers of those books were not simply passing on a single unbroken memory. They were organising, they had bits and pieces, older spells, loose spirit names, scattered legends, numerological hints that 72 is a complete number. They pulled those fragments together into a grid. 72 becomes a way to say this is not random. This is the whole set. The unseen world might be frightening, but look, we have arranged it into a table with headings and numbers. Each entry has a name, a rank, a description, a symbol, like drawers in a cabinet. From that angle, the legend is doing something very human. It is taking fear and turning it into a list. The same move shows up again and again. In late antiquity, people worried about illness and the evil eye copy amulets crowded with divine and angelic names, often labelled as Solomonic. In the medieval period, when demons are a constant presence in sermons and imagination, compilers turn vague anxieties into structured hierarchies, complete with seals and protocols. In the Renaissance, scholars uncomfortable with raw superstition wrapped those structures in philosophy and astrology, saying, in effect, "This is not chaos. This is a science. The content changes, but the logic is stable." When something feels too big and formless, plague, misfortune, spiritual danger, you give it boundaries. You say there are this many forces with these names, governed by these rules, controlled by this ring. You put the chaos on paper and call it a system. Solomon is the imagined figure who makes that feel plausible. If an ordinary person tried to claim that kind of mastery, it would seem presumptuous, maybe even blasphemous. But a legendary king who already stands at the threshold between heaven and earth, who already built God's house and listened to birds, he can be given that role. He is distant enough and reverent enough that placing the catalogue under his seal feels safer. In that sense, the legend is less about historical memory and more about psychological architecture. It offers a way to live with uncertainty. You may not believe in literal demons sitting in circles in front of an ancient throne. You may think of all this purely as folklore, or as an old language for what we now call impulses, traumas, or social forces. But the shape of the story still resonates. It says, whatever haunts you, it can be named. However many worries crowd around your bed at night, there is, in principle, a list. There are rules. There is a place where even the powers that terrify you have to answer to someone. For some, that someone is a literal king with a ring. For others, it's a symbol of divine order, or of reason itself, sitting calmly in the middle of the storm. So, when we talk about Solomon and his 72 demons, we are also talking about a broad human habit, turning raw anxiety into something that can be counted, diagrammed, even whispered over in the quiet of a dark room. You do not have to choose only one interpretation. You can see the legend as myth, as metaphor, as a window onto ancient ritual practice, as a mirror of your own ways of organizing fear. You can read it devotionally, skeptically, aesthetically, or just as a strangely soothing piece of cultural history. If you feel like sharing, you're welcome to add your own reading to that long conversation. What does this story mean to you? Do you lean toward historical curiosity, psychological symbolism, spiritual reality, or some mixture of all three? As you drift towards sleep, how do you understand the figure of Solomon? As a magician, a prophet, a wise king, or simply a name on a very old page? If you'd like to keep exploring questions like these together, it genuinely helps if you tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe for more slow, thoughtful history. And if you're comfortable sharing, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Which city, which region, which corner of the world is joining Solomon and his restless spirits in the dark?